You're about to hear something that might completely change how you understand the women in your life. What I'm going to share has been hidden in plain sight for almost a century now. Carl Jung, one of history's most brilliant minds, uncovered a psychological truth about women that most men are completely blind to, and it's costing them everything in their relationships. I was that guy too, until I wasn't. Stay until the end, because the final insight revolutionized not just my relationships, but my entire understanding of the masculine-feminine dynamic. This isn't something you'll hear in typical relationship advice. Hidden wisdom. Most men today walk around completely asleep to what's actually happening in their relationships with women. I know because I spent most of my life being that guy, the one who thought he understood women because I could quote a few psychology books or relationship gurus. But nothing prepared me for what happened when I truly began studying Jung's work on the feminine psyche. Let me take you back to a moment that changed everything for me. 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in my apartment after my fiancée had walked out. She didn't just leave, she disappeared from my life with 3 words that haunted me. You never saw. At the time, I had no idea what she meant. I thought I'd been attentive, supportive, everything a modern man should be. I'd listened to her problems, helped with solutions, given her space when she needed it. What hadn't I seen? That question led me down a rabbit hole that eventually brought me to Carl Jung's writings on the anima and feminine psychology, and what I discovered there wasn't just eye-opening, it was world-shattering. The truth Jung uncovered almost a century ago is something that's been systematically erased from our modern understanding of relationships: psychological blindness. Jung discovered something profound about the feminine psyche that most men remain completely blind to. Women don't just want to be understood logically, they need to be witnessed emotionally. But there's something deeper. Jung realized that women embody what he called the unconscious in a way that most men never fully grasp. Think about it like this. For Jung, masculine consciousness tends to be directed, focused, rational. It separates, categorizes, and creates hierarchies. But the feminine psyche, what he called the anima, in men and a woman's own nature, connects to the mysterious, the emotional, the unconscious realms that can't be easily articulated or solved. This isn't about gender stereotypes. It's about psychological energetics that exist within all of us, regardless of gender. What makes this truth dark isn't that it's negative. It's that it exists in the shadow of our awareness. Men keep trying to solve women like they're problems to be fixed, when what's actually happening is that women are often connecting to parts of life and existence that rationality alone can't touch. Have you ever been in a conversation with a woman where she seems frustrated but you can't figure out what the actual problem is? You ask direct questions, offer solutions, and she just gets more upset, maybe saying, "You don't get it," or "That's not what I'm saying." That's this principle in action. You're trying to solve a rational problem, but she's expressing something from the unconscious that doesn't fit into neat categories. Relational depths. Jung believed that the feminine principle is naturally more attuned to the interconnectedness of all things, to the web of relationships that give life meaning. This creates a profound difference in how women often experience relationships compared to men. Where men might compartmentalize relationships as one aspect of life, women frequently experience them as the context within which life occurs. This is why the statement, "I'm fine" from a woman often means something entirely different than when a man says it. It's not that she's being deceptive or manipulative, it's that her emotional reality exists in layers that simple words often can't fully capture, and she's testing, unconsciously usually, whether you can sense those deeper currents. I remember arguing with my ex about something trivial. I think it was about plans for the weekend. But as the argument escalated, I kept focusing on the logical details while completely missing that what she was really expressing was a fear that I was pulling away emotionally. The plans weren't the point at all, but I was so focused on being right about the surface issue that I missed the entire emotional dimension. When Jung talks about the anima, the feminine aspect within men, he's pointing to our own internal connection to these deeper emotional currents. Men who are disconnected from their anima often find women completely mystifying or frustrating because they're encountering an aspect of life they've been taught to repress within themselves. Unconscious patterns. One of Jung's most profound insights was his understanding of projection. He believed that what we haven't consciously integrated within ourselves, we project onto others. For many men, this means projecting their unacknowledged emotional needs and feminine aspects onto the women in their lives. This creates an impossible situation. The woman becomes responsible for carrying all the emotional complexity that the man has disowned in himself. She becomes the vessel for his unacknowledged feelings, intuitions, and relationship needs. And when she inevitably fails to perfectly contain all that, because no one person can be everything for another, he feels betrayed. I see this all the time with guys who complain that women are too emotional or irrational. What's really happening is that these men are encountering aspects of life that they've cut themselves off from. The woman isn't being too anything. She's simply embodying a fuller spectrum of human experience that includes the rational and the emotional, the conscious and the unconscious. Jung would say that the path forward isn't to try to figure women out as if they're some alien species. It's to reclaim the aspects of ourselves that we've rejected or repressed. When men start to acknowledge their own emotional depths, their own needs for connection, their own intuitive capacities, suddenly women don't seem so mysterious anymore. Primal knowing. Here's where Jung's insights get really interesting and challenging for modern men. He believed that women often have a more direct connection to what he called the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of human experience that transcends our individual lives. This manifests as intuition, as emotional intelligence, as an ability to sense underlying patterns that logic alone might miss. I can't tell you how many times I've witnessed a woman sense something off about a situation or person that I couldn't detect with my rational mind, only to discover later that she was absolutely right. Jung would say this isn't magic or some special female power. It's access to layers of awareness that our hyper-rational culture has taught men to ignore. Think about how often women in your life have said things like, "I just have a feeling," or "something doesn't seem right." How often have you dismissed those statements because they weren't backed by concrete evidence? And how often, in retrospect, were those intuitions accurate? This is the part of Jung's work that's hardest for modern men to accept. We've been taught that knowledge only counts if it can be articulated logically and proven empirically. The idea that there might be other valid ways of knowing, through emotion, through bodily sensation, through intuitive flashes, threatens the very foundation of masculine identity in our culture. But here's the truth: integration of these seemingly opposite ways of knowing is what Jung saw as the path to wholeness. Not rejecting rationality, but expanding beyond its limitations, not dismissing emotion, but understanding its wisdom. Shadow work. The darkest aspect of Jung's truth about women relates to what he called the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we reject, repress, or deny. For many men, feminine qualities like emotional sensitivity, intuition, and relational awareness get pushed into the shadow because they don't fit our cultural ideal of masculinity. But Jung was adamant: what we repress doesn't disappear. It goes underground and eventually erupts in distorted ways. Men who repress their feminine aspects often end up projecting their shadows onto the women in their lives, creating relationships characterized by unconscious resentment and misunderstanding. I witnessed this dynamic in my own father. He was stoic, logical, never showing vulnerability, but whenever my mother expressed emotion, he became irrationally angry. Her tears, her intuitive concerns, her emotional needs, all of these triggered something in him that he couldn't acknowledge. He wasn't just rejecting her emotional reality, he was rejecting the emotional reality within himself. This pattern repeats across generations until someone does the work to break it. And make no mistake, it is work. Looking at your own shadow, acknowledging the rejected parts of yourself, integrating what you've been taught to despise, this is some of the most challenging psychological work a person can do. But the alternative is to remain half alive, constantly projecting your disowned parts onto others, particularly the women in your life. This creates relationships based on illusion rather than reality, on projection rather than authentic connection. Emotional intelligence. Jung believed that genuine relationship becomes possible only when we stop projecting and start relating to others as they actually are, not as carriers of our unconscious material. For men relating to women, this means developing what we now call emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and engage with the full spectrum of human emotion. But emotional intelligence isn't just about being nice or saying the right things. It's about developing a relationship with your own emotional reality so that you can authentically engage with the emotional reality of others. It's about expanding your capacity to hold complexity rather than reducing everything to problems that need solving. I remember the first time I really practiced this with a woman I was dating after my engagement ended. She was sharing something painful about her past, and I could feel myself wanting to jump in with advice, to fix it for her. But instead, I just breathed and stayed present. I let myself feel the sadness of her story without trying to escape it or solve it. And something extraordinary happened. A level of connection opened up that I'd never experienced before. Sacred feminine. Jung wrote extensively about archetypes, universal patterns that appear across cultures and throughout history. One of the most powerful archetypes in his work is the divine feminine, which represents qualities like creativity, intuition, receptivity, and life-giving power. In many ancient cultures, the feminine was worshipped as sacred. Goddesses represented not just fertility, but wisdom, justice, and transformation. But over centuries, particularly in Western culture, the feminine became increasingly devalued and controlled. What was once seen as sacred became feared and suppressed. This historical and cultural context matters because it shapes how men today relate to women and to feminine qualities in themselves. When we're raised in a culture that subtly, or not so subtly, devalues the feminine, we internalize those attitudes without even realizing it. I noticed this in myself when I began seriously studying Jung. Despite considering myself progressive and respectful toward women, I discovered layers of unconscious bias that influenced how I interpreted women's emotional responses or intuitive insights. I'd been taught to see rationality as superior to emotion, direct communication as superior to intuitive understanding, without ever questioning those hierarchies. Jung would argue that true psychological maturity involves recognizing that these aren't hierarchies at all. Rationality isn't better than emotion. They're different modes of engaging with reality, each with its own validity and wisdom. Direct communication isn't superior to intuitive understanding. They're different ways of knowing, each with its own strengths and limitations. Divine union. For Jung, the ultimate goal of psychological development is what he called individuation, becoming a whole, integrated person by acknowledging and incorporating all aspects of the psyche. This includes integrating the masculine and feminine energies within each of us regardless of our biological sex. He believed that the most profound relationships between men and women become possible when each person is engaged in this process of individuation. When a man is in contact with his own inner feminine, anima, he can relate to women as they are, not as projections of his unconscious needs or fears. And the same is true for women connecting with their inner masculine, animus. What makes this vision so challenging and so rarely achieved is that it requires us to do our own inner work rather than expecting our partners to complete us. It requires facing our shadows, our wounds, our cultural conditioning. It's much easier to blame relationship problems on gender differences or communication styles than to look at how our own unconscious patterns are contributing. I spent years blaming my relationship failures on choosing the wrong women or on fundamental differences between men and women. It was humbling to finally recognize how much of the problem was my own lack of psychological integration, my own unwillingness to face parts of myself that didn't fit my idea of masculinity. Emotional alchemy. One of the most powerful aspects of Jung's psychology is his understanding of transformation. He didn't just diagnose psychological problems, he offered a path toward healing and wholeness. For men struggling to understand and connect with women, this path involves a kind of emotional alchemy, transforming unconscious patterns into conscious awareness. This transformation rarely happens through intellectual understanding alone. You can read 100 books about Jung's theories and still miss the point if you're not willing to engage with your own emotional reality. It requires practice, reflection, and often the help of others who can see what we cannot see in ourselves. For me, this process involved learning to sit with uncomfortable emotions rather than immediately trying to solve or escape them. It involved paying attention to my dreams and the symbols that emerged from my unconscious. It involved asking trusted friends, particularly women friends, for honest feedback about my blind spots in relationships. One of the most valuable practices was simply learning to listen differently. Instead of listening to respond or solve, I practiced listening to understand the emotional reality behind the words. This doesn't mean accepting everything uncritically or abandoning critical thinking. It means expanding my awareness to include emotional dimensions I'd previously ignored. The results weren't immediate, but they were profound. Conversations that would have previously devolved into arguments became opportunities for deeper connection. Behaviors in women that would have seemed irrational or confusing began to make emotional sense. And most importantly, I started to recognize and honor my own emotional needs rather than expecting women to somehow fulfill them without my having to acknowledge them. Relationship revolution. What Jung offers men is nothing short of a revolution in how we approach relationships with women. Instead of seeing women as mysterious others who need to be figured out or managed, we can recognize them as full human beings navigating the same complex inner territory that we are, albeit sometimes with different maps. This shift doesn't mean denying the real biological and socialized differences that can exist between men and women. It means not using those differences as excuses to avoid understanding each other or ourselves more deeply. It means recognizing that beneath the surface differences lie common human needs for connection, meaning, and recognition. I've witnessed this revolution in my male friends who've done this work. Their relationships with women, whether romantic partners, colleagues, friends, or family members, take on a depth and authenticity that wasn't possible before. Conflicts still arise, of course, but they're handled with greater awareness and less projection. One friend described it as taking off glasses I didn't know I was wearing. He suddenly could see women's emotional responses, not as problems to be solved, but as information to be understood. Another friend realized he'd been unconsciously seeking a mother figure in his romantic relationships, expecting a kind of emotional caretaking that wasn't appropriate for an adult partnership. These realizations aren't always comfortable. In fact, they're often painful because they require confronting ways we've failed in our relationships or ways we've been wounded. But on the other side of that discomfort lies the possibility of connection based on reality rather than illusion. Conscious partnership. Jung believed that relationships between men and women have the potential to be crucibles for psychological growth when approached consciously. The tensions and differences that arise aren't obstacles to overcome, but opportunities for each person to recognize and integrate disowned aspects of themselves. This is a radical departure from how many of us think about relationships. We're often taught that the goal is to find someone who completes us or to eliminate conflict through better communication techniques. Jung suggests something much more challenging, using the relationship as a mirror to see ourselves more clearly. I've come to believe that this approach is not just psychologically sound, but practically effective. When I stopped expecting women to accommodate my unconscious expectations and started using our interactions as opportunities for self-awareness, the quality of my relationships transformed dramatically. This doesn't mean becoming self-absorbed or turning every relationship issue into a therapy session. It means taking responsibility for your own psychological material rather than projecting it onto others. It means approaching differences with curiosity rather than judgment. One practice that's been helpful for me is asking, what am I not seeing here? What might be happening beneath the surface? This simple question opens space for understanding rather than immediate reaction. It acknowledges that my perspective is limited and that there might be emotional dimensions I'm missing. Masculine awakening. For men, engaging with Jung's insights about women often catalyzes a broader awakening to aspects of masculinity that have been narrowed and distorted in our culture. When we recognize the limitations of purely rational approaches to life, we can begin reclaiming a more complete version of masculine energy that includes emotional depth, intuitive wisdom, and relational awareness. This isn't about becoming less masculine, it's about expanding what masculinity can encompass. It's about recognizing that strength can include vulnerability, that leadership can include receptivity, that certainty can include openness to mystery. I've watched men transform when they realize they don't have to choose between being masculine and being emotionally intelligent. One friend, a successful business leader, described it as finding a gear I didn't know my engine had. He discovered that tuning into emotional undercurrents in his team actually made him more effective as a leader, not less. Another friend, who had always prided himself on his logical approach to life, began paying attention to his dreams and intuitions. Far from undermining his rational capabilities, this additional information made his decisions more nuanced and ultimately more successful. This awakening doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of gradually expanding awareness, of catching yourself in old patterns and choosing new responses. It's about building the psychological muscles to hold complexity rather than reducing everything to either-or thinking. Final insight. Here's what changed everything for me. The insight that I promised at the beginning. Jung believed that what most men see as women's emotional complexity is actually a mirror reflecting their own unlived wholeness. Let that sink in. The very qualities in women that men find most confusing, frustrating, or overwhelming are often the exact qualities they've been conditioned to repress in themselves. The emotional sensitivity that seems excessive, the intuitive knowing that seems irrational, the relational awareness that seems unnecessary. These aren't female mysteries, they're human capacities that many men have been taught to disconnect from. When I fully grasped this, my approach to relationships transformed. Instead of seeing women's emotional responses as problems to solve, I began seeing them as invitations to expand my own emotional range. Instead of dismissing intuitive insights as irrational, I started paying attention to my own intuition. Instead of seeing relationship concerns as distractions from what matters, I recognized how central relationships are to a meaningful life. This doesn't mean uncritically accepting everything a woman says or does. Women aren't perfect oracles or emotional gurus by virtue of being female. They're human beings with their own wounds, projections, and distortions. The point isn't to idealize women, but to recognize the full humanity in both men and women, a humanity that includes rationality and emotion, consciousness and unconsciousness, focus and receptivity. The dark truth Jung revealed isn't that women are unknowable or that men are doomed to misunderstand them. It's that the path to understanding between men and women runs straight through our own unacknowledged depths. It's only by facing what we've rejected in ourselves that we can truly see and connect with others. This work isn't easy, but it's transformative. And in a world desperately needing balanced, integrated approaches to our enormous challenges, it might be some of the most important work we can do, not just for our personal relationships, but for our collective future. The choice is yours now. You can dismiss these ideas and continue relating to women through the filters of cultural conditioning and unconscious projection. Or you can use this as an invitation to begin your own journey toward wholeness, a journey that might just transform every relationship in your life. What I know now is this. The woman who walked out saying "you never saw" was right. I hadn't seen. Not really. I hadn't seen her complexity because I hadn't acknowledged my own. I hadn't witnessed her emotional truth because I was disconnected from mine. The greatest gift we can offer the important women in our lives isn't protection, solutions, or even understanding. It's the courage to encounter our own depths so we can truly witness theirs. And that witnessing, that mutual recognition of each other's full humanity, is what creates the potential for love that goes beyond romantic fantasy into something real, enduring, and transformative. That's the relationship revolution Jung was pointing toward almost a century ago, and it's still waiting for most men to catch up.